Hi, I'm Beth Stroupe-Menge, a member of the Minishoshe-Mandan chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, or DAR. DAR is a nonprofit, non-political, volunteer women's service organization founded in 1890 and dedicated to promoting patriotism, preserving American history, and securing America's future through better education for our children. DAR members volunteer millions of service hours annually in their local communities, including supporting active duty military personnel and assisting veterans, awarding financial aid to students, and financially supporting schools for underserved children. As one of the most inclusive genealogical societies in the country, DAR is open to any woman 18 years or older, regardless of race, religion, or ethnic background, who can prove lineal descent from a patriot of the American Revolution.
I'm Connie, Sprynczynatyk, also a member of the local DAR chapter. As our nation celebrates 250 years since the founding of America, North Dakota's America 250 Commission has generously provided a grant to our chapter for this series, the President's Kitchen Cabinet. We are also partnered with Dakota Media Access and with Rick Cullen, a presidential historian who has taught classes about America's presidents at the college and university levels, as well as for the North Dakota Humanities Council. Rick is a grandfather, I'll start with that first, also an author, a publisher. During the episodes, we will also be joined by local DAR chapter members in colonial attire, offering etiquette advice from the bygone days. Our goal in this mini-series is to bring presidential history alive with Rick, and then Beth and I will talk about White House life as we cook favorite presidential foods. This series is part discussion of culture in America along with history you can taste, what we call history on a fork. Our first cooking segment featured recipes from two founding fathers plus Abraham Lincoln. Today we'll talk about Theodore Roosevelt and several other presidents who have perhaps surprising ties to our state. Beth, we talked cookbooks in our first episode. Remind us of some of your favorites.
Absolutely. I think any cook probably has a number of favorite cookbooks. And when you start talking about history, there are a number of cookbooks available. In the first episode, we talked about one of my favorites was a KFYR cookbook that was produced in the 1970s. I did pull out several of my vintage cookbooks that have been handed down from family members that are favorites. Of course, we have The Joy of Cooking and the Good Housekeeping Cookbook. So any cook that's starting out that wants recipes from sort of the good old days or an introduction to cooking, these are fabulous cookbooks. When we start talking about history, I pulled another oldie. It's called an American Sampler Cookbook. And this cookbook has recipes from various members of Congress. And through the years, a number of cookbooks have been produced, with the various congressional folks as well as presidents. So if you're thinking of wanting to cook some type of meal with history, there's fabulous cookbooks, but there's also the internet. So in doing research for some of the recipes that we're going to be doing today, I also turn to the internet because not only does it include recipes from the various presidential libraries, but also, some of the family favorites and some of the history behind those recipes. So it's always fun to be able to put together history, particularly in this year of America 250, with some of the meals of our forefathers.
It really is a walk through history. Whenever you open up a cookbook, really it can be a brand new one. Yes. Later I'll show you a copy of a cookbook that's new, but it's only focused in the past. It's a fun way to celebrate America's 250.
Yes. Yes.
This American Sampler Cookbook is one I've not seen, but later I think I want to dive into it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We are going to turn from cookbooks, we'll come back to that. We're going to turn to our presidential historian, Rick Collins. I know you talked in our first episode about your early interest in presidential history. You grew up in several parts of the country, but spent a fair amount of time on the East Coast before coming west. You're going to help us walk through some presidents today who may have some surprising ties to North Dakota. We're going to talk about Hayes, Harrison, FDR, and of course, we couldn't do this episode without talking about Teddy.
The one and only.
So will you start with Hayes? How was he tied to North Dakota?
Well, Hayes was, he's a very interesting man. He's one of 5 presidents who fought in the Civil War. He's the only one who was actually wounded in battle. He was a brigadier general in the Civil War. He's the first incumbent president to visit what is now North Dakota. When he visited, it was Dakota Territory. He had been on a train trip west, and he came back going east. He stopped in Fargo, and he had his wife with him, and he also, Lucy, and 3 of their 7 sons were along on the trip. And so he attended a breakfast in Fargo. This would have been September of 1878. And then he wanted to visit the great Bonanza farm that Oliver Dalrymple, whose great-great-grandson, Jack Dalrymple, was our governor from 2010 to 2016. And so he visited Dalrymple's farm, Bonanza Farm, and those Bonanza farms are legendary, late 19th century, early 20th century. And Oliver Dalrymple had the largest Bonanza farm at the time. It was some 100,000 acres, and they had several hundred men and horses, thousands of horses that had to be out there, a lot of machinery to handle the farm. And so Hayes spent time at the Bonanza farm and had a great visit with Oliver Dalrymple. Jack Dalrymple came out with a book not too long ago documenting his great-grandfather's Bonanza farm. And it's a good read, and it's an interesting book, and there's a photo in there of Oliver Dalrymple standing next to President Hayes, very proud about showing off his Bonanza farm.
And you were the publisher of that book, weren't you?
Yes, my wife and I have a publishing company called Smoky Water Press, and we worked with Jack. It had been a thesis, a history thesis he had written back in 1970 when he was attending Yale University. And then he had written it, and it was quite good, but he didn't do anything with it. And then he decided a few years ago he wanted to get it out in book form. So my wife Andrea and I worked with him to kind of edit it up a little bit and put it in book form. And we helped him publish it about a year ago, and it's a wonderful book.
And he spoke about that book at Statehood Day.
At Statehood Day, the kickoff of the North Dakota 250 Commission Statehood Day, which was very appropriate last November 2nd. So Hayes is interesting in that connection. He's the first of 15 of our last 26 presidents have actually visited North Dakota. And Hayes was the first incumbent president to do that. He also owned a piece of farmland here north of Bismarck, a 930-acre farm in Hay Creek Township. And that was given to him by the Northern Pacific Railroad right after he was elected president. Now today that would be, conflict of interest maybe, the little ethics question going on, but back then it wasn't an issue. And so he received the farm. He never actually attended or came out and saw it. He had a good friend take care of it for him. But they sold it, or Hayes sold it 1885 for about $21,000. But it was a well-maintained farm in Hay Creek Township.
Wonder who owns it today. We'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
Tell us about his wife. She was interesting.
Lucy Hayes was a very interesting first lady. They're all interesting first ladies, right? They're all interesting presidents. There's not a dullard in the bunch. She was a woman who was really involved in the temperance movement, and she didn't like alcohol. And so one of the things she did when she became First Lady was she banned all alcohol being served at the White House. It was popular with a lot of the temperance people, of course, and those that didn't want to see alcohol served, but it was not popular with those that enjoyed a drink at the White House and socializing, whatever. She served lemonade and punch, and so her nickname became Lemonade Lucy. And that was what she was known as during her time in the White House. But she also was a very gracious hostess. They put on a lot of state dinners and entertained an awful lot of people. And they also had the first telephone in the White House, the Hayes, and they because Alexander Graham Bell, you remember in 1876, had actually invented the telephone, and Hayes was in the White House from 1877 to 81. First telephone was put in the White House about 1879, and their phone number was 1. The White House phone number was 1.
Of course it
Easy
was.
to remember. So.
And she was educated. She was.
Yes, yeah. She was the first lady who received who had a college degree, and she also really loved art and artwork, and she worked hard to get a portrait of Martha Washington put into the White House to be with the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. She thought George needed Martha by his side, so she worked to get a portrait of Martha Washington in the White House as well.
Good job, because of course they were a team.
Absolutely.
The first family serves alongside the president.
Yes, that's right.
Tell us about Benjamin Harrison. That is not a president people would connect readily with North Dakota.
Harrison, he's another very interesting president. He was born in Ohio, but he really had his professional career, political career in Indiana. He had an icy kind of an aloof demeanor, so his nickname was the Indiana Iceberg. But he was a very effective president in his own ways. He was the grandson of the 9th president of the United States, William Henry Harrison, who only served about a month before he died at the age of 68 in 1841. And then he was the great-grandson of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And his father was a congressman from Ohio, so politics was very much in Benjamin Harrison's blood. Probably the biggest connection, I think obviously the biggest connection he has to us here in North Dakota, he signed the statehood papers that brought us into the Union. 6 states came into the Union during Harrison's presidency: Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And there was a lot of controversy and a lot of politics involved in bringing North Dakota and South Dakota into the Union, separate states. It had been this big Dakota Territory for a long time. Very interesting history, the Dakota Territory, politics and all that. That's a whole nother story. But Harrison didn't want to be blamed for bringing one in over the other, so he had his Secretary of State, James Blaine, mix up the two statehood papers for North Dakota and South Dakota, had them shift them around so he didn't know what they were, had them, he said, I just want to see the signature line. I want to see anything else on the paper. So Harrison signed on the signature line, bringing in North Dakota and South Dakota. No one knows which one was first. So alphabetically, North Dakota is the 39th state, and South Dakota, sorry, is number 40.
What kind of firsts did he have in the White House?
He was, one of the things he really pushed hard at was, well, he had electricity. That was one thing, I guess it's one of the first. He was the first president to get electricity in the White House. He and his wife Caroline they loved the idea of electricity because you could flick a switch, right, and lights would come on. You didn't have to have candles lit and all that. But they were scared to death of being electrocuted. It was brand new. They didn't want to have lose their life over trying to turn on an electric switch. So they would always have White House staff turn on the switch, turn it off, do whatever. But they never themselves did the electrical switch thing. He also was a big proponent of modernizing the Navy. And one of the things, one of his key contributions was he built up he actually built up the Navy quite a bit. There were 3 steel-hulled ships when he came into the White House. 4 years later, we had 22 steel-hulled ships, including laying the groundwork for our first battleships. So, and then another thing that is interesting about Harrison, we think about Teddy Roosevelt being the conservation president, and we'll talk a lot more about TR later. But Harrison set aside, like TR did later, setting aside some 230 million acres of public land for all these parks and all the other blessings we have today. Harrison set aside 15 million acres of public land for some national forests all around the country. And he was the first president to really address conservation on that scale. So that was another first Harrison had.
And he had an interesting family, including his wife, Carolyn. I think Beth has
Carolyn?
I'm very
information
excited to
Right.
tell about Carolyn.
Carolyn.
So Carolyn Scott Harrison was the First Lady in 1890. And at that point in time, the Sons of the American Revolution had set up an organization, but they voted to not allow women to join the organization. And there were 4 women that decided that they wanted their own organization to celebrate the country, to show their patriotism. The 4 women introduced the idea to Carolyn of setting up the Daughters of the American Revolution. And she embraced it and became the first general president of the organization. She's also the first lady to actually do a national speech introducing the idea. She's the first sitting first lady to do a national speech. And it was regarding Daughters of the American Revolution. So she really championed that women participate and be very active in our country and celebrate the women in the past, because women contributed a lot in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and really acknowledging that and celebrating that.
Of course they did.
Yes.
And then she died shortly before his presidency ended, a couple
Yes.
weeks before the 1892 presidential election.
Yes.
She died, and it was a great loss to Benjamin Harrison. He married her niece a few years later after leaving the White House, and they had, I think they had 1 child after they left the White House. But she's an interesting woman too. She survived him by like 48 years.
She died in was it the 40s?
Yeah, like 1948, I think, something like that. Yeah.
So, shall we talk the Roosevelts?
Sure.
Let's start with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who people wouldn't automatically think, if you said President Roosevelt, we all think of Teddy. We'll talk about Teddy, but start us out with Franklin and the impact some of his administration programs had on North Dakota.
Boy, where do you start with FDR? He was, only president to serve 4 terms, 12 plus years in the White House. He actually served just 3 months of his 4th term, and then he died in office. But FDR, he was the first president to name a woman to his cabinet, which I think is significant. Frances Perkins was his Secretary of Labor. And she was the only cabinet member who served FDR throughout the entire time of his presidency. In fact, she served a little bit into Harry Truman's, and then she left his administration shortly afterwards. But FDR visited North Dakota several times. He came here in, 1934 he visited Devil's Lake gave a speech, like 35,000 people attended, wanted to hear him talk about New Deal relief programs and so on. 1936, he came out on a drought tour, and he stopped in Bismarck and Mandan in 1936. At that time, the dirty 30s, the farmers were really struggling with trying to make ends meet. A lot of farmers were going under because of the Depression and the lack of good climate. And he stopped and visited with farmers in Mandan, and he also visited actually the state capitol grounds in Bismarck, and his fifth cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, the Maltese cross cabin that FD or TR had at Medora, his first lodge he had out there in the middle 1880s. They had moved it to the Capitol grounds, and eventually, and so he visited that also and paid tribute. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Maltese cross cabin when we talk about TR. His New Deal programs were crucial to helping bring North Dakota and the country out of the Depression. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, they built a lot of structure here in North Dakota. Fort Lincoln State Park, you know, their visitor center, and the fort, the fort, Army fort sections that are built out there were built by the CCC. The Indian Earth Lodge reconstructed out there, built by the CCC. The Visitor Center built by the CCC. And then also another program they had was called the Works Civilian Administration, the WCA, or no, the Work Recovery Administration, I think that's right. And that was just one, less than a year, the first year of Roosevelt's administration, 1933, this program came in. It's called the Civil Works Administration. That's what it was, the CWA. Anyway, that was one of the things about Roosevelt. Alphabet soup. I mean, it was like CCC, WPA, on and on. And so this particular one, they really focused on Grand Forks County, and they put a lot of money into helping Grand Forks County with infrastructure, rebuilding of roads, rebuilding of houses, and other infrastructure. And they put like $230,000 into Grand Forks County alone, and today that'd be the equivalent of about $6 million. And that particular administration program only lasted from like November of 33 through March of 34. So it was short-lived. It wasn't one of the longer ones like the WPA or the CCC, but it did good things for North Dakota.
So I have read that North Dakota, among all of the states, probably benefited the greatest from the policies, the programs that came out of his administration. Would that be your take on?
I think that'd be safe to say. North Dakota, historians have said North Dakota suffered probably if not the most, certainly among the most in terms of the states that were hit hard by the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression.
Sure. From FDR, shall we turn to everybody's favorite president in North Dakota, I think. His fifth cousin, FDR's cousin, Theodore, was president turn of the century.
Right.
Do you want to talk about Teddy?
Good old Teddy. I mean, he's one of a kind. I mean, he's just incredible. His daughter, Alice, said he wanted to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening. In other words, he loved the spotlight, and he always grabbed the spotlight wherever he went. He was just truly an incredible man in so many ways. He born in 1858 in New York City. I think most of us are familiar with the story, a terrible story of his mother and his wife dying on the same day. His mother was only 48 years old. And this was on Valentine's Day of 1884, February 14th, 1884. His mother died in the morning of, it was typhoid fever. And then his wife had given birth to the daughter, Alice, in 2 days earlier, February 12th. And then she died in the afternoon. She was only 22 years old. She had Bright's disease, kidney failure. And Roosevelt kept a diary, and he said, he just put a big black X for the entry for that particular day. It says, the light has gone out of my life. And so...
That influenced his departure from the East, didn't
yes.
it? Is that why he came to North Dakota?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, he had been out to North Dakota. He had been hunting birds in the Red River Valley. That was his first exposure in the fall of 1880. His brother and him came out and hunted birds around the Moorhead area, and they really liked it, loved it. And then Roosevelt came back out in the fall of 1883. This would have been 5 months before the death of his wife and mother, to hunt bison. He wanted to take on, he was concerned that the bison herds were dwindling as they were, and he wanted to come out and get his first bison before they all disappeared. And so he came out in the fall of 1883, and that's when he first was exposed to Medora. And he invested in this Cross Ranch cabin, and that's where he first got to know the people of Medora a little bit. And so when his wife and mother died in 1884, he was absolutely devastated. He wanted to just get out of there, and he thought, I'm going to go back to the West where there, you know, I loved the outdoors and just the whole atmosphere, and I need to get away. And so he gave his daughter Alice, the little baby, to his sister, and she took care of Alice while he went out to Medora in the West.
Well, speaking of Medora, of course, the newest presidential library
Yes.
will be hosted by Medora. And if we can pause on Teddy for just a few minutes to talk about presidential libraries. There are, 16 of them around the country that are administered by the Archives Administration, but I think there are more than that. Are there?
But there are plenty more than that, but they're all privately owned. I mean, before, you know, Herbert Hoover was the first one to actually be taken care of by the NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration. And all the ones since Hoover are under that. For a while, Nixon was a privately owned foundation. That was after Watergate, complicated story. But eventually Nixon's library got into the NARA, and they're also part of it now. But there are many that, you know, aren't. I'm thinking like James Knox Polk has a library that's private. Abraham Lincoln, there's an Abraham Lincoln library and museum. It's in Illinois. Has a lot of his papers and his documents, but that's also privately operated. So there were many that George Washington, Mount Vernon has a lot of his records, and other places have his records as well. So a lot of presidents had their, before Hoover on, privately owned, but they're all over the country.
Rick, we didn't have a lot of time in the first episode to talk about books, but all three of us love to read about presidents and history in general. So tell us about Washington, Adams, and Lincoln books that you would recommend.
So many books, right? And not enough time to read all the books. But there are several books that, for each of those presidents, that I highly recommend. And we're just going to talk about maybe 1, 2 at the most, each one. The first one, this is Ron Chernow's book on George Washington, which is just an outstanding read. Chernow has written also massive biographies of like Alexander Hamilton, and Mark Twain is his latest. I'm reading that now and enjoying that very much. But this is such a comprehensive book, and it really captures Washington personally as well as professionally. So I really highly recommend this book. That's Ron Chernow.
Love this book.
It's a wonderful book. It's a great doorstop too, by the way.
It's many pages. Right. How
Another
about
one, David McCullough. John Adams. This is another classic. Came out, I think about, well, it's been quite a while since this book came out. This was printed back in 2001, about 25 years ago. But it's a wonderful book, and of course David McCullough has written all kinds of wonderful history books. So that's another highly recommended one. And then I think you can't have a book about John Adams without also having one about Abigail Adams, because they were truly a dynamic duo. married like 54 years, and she was a very strong force behind her husband, with her husband. And so this is a wonderful book by Joseph Ellis called First Family, Abigail and John Adams. Another highly recommended one. Then Abraham Lincoln. Oh my goodness, more books have been written about Abraham Lincoln than anyone else except Jesus Christ. Over 15,000 books have been written about Abraham Lincoln. So where do you start? Well, this is probably considered by many people as the best single volume biography of Lincoln. David Herbert Donald came out about 30 years ago.
I'll add this one to my list.
It's a wonderful, wonderful read. And again, there's so many outstanding Lincoln biographies, but another one I think is a must-reading is Team of Rivals. This is a phenomenal book that Doris Kearns Goodwin came out with about 20 years ago. And it's all about how Lincoln brought his enemies under his tent to help him govern the nation, because he saw the great crisis we were undergoing as we divided into civil war. And so the rivals were those who had competed against him for the 1860 Republican nomination, including William Seward, who became his Secretary of State, and also Salmon P. Chase, who became his Secretary of the Treasury. And they served Lincoln well. Lincoln ended up appointing Salmon P. Chase Chief Justice in 1864. They served Lincoln and the country very well. So that's another highly recommended book.
We'll talk a little bit later about, while Beth and I are cooking, we'll talk about books that you like from today's episode, Presidents.
Yep.
But I am now a doorstop. Beth, will you take over?
Yes. So Rick, let's continue to talk a little bit more about Teddy, because he really did have a number of accomplishments from being the youngest president on.
Well, he did. I think probably the greatest legacy he's got, as I mentioned earlier, our conservation president. You know, he was he had come out here, like I mentioned earlier, in the early mid-1880s and seen the glory and the beauty of the Badlands and all the hunting and all the wildlife that was out here, the pristine nature of so much of the environment and the landscape. And when he became president, he wanted to help preserve that, because he was afraid that it was going to be gobbled up by big corporations, rich money people who would make it their own private preserves, like he had seen in Europe. A lot of that was going on in Europe. And he wanted to make sure that the general public had access to this. So he set aside some 230 million acres of public land and gave us all kinds of national forests, national parks, national monuments, national game, wildlife reserves, game refuges that we enjoy very much to this day. And he was also someone who was very active in consumer protection. I'm thinking of a couple things: the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Upton Sinclair had written this infamous book about the horrors of the meat industry and how it was absolutely full of all kinds of disease and dangers to the public. And so he pushed hard to get legislation through to have the federal government be able to monitor the meat industry and the food industry, so it'd be much safer for the public and the consumers. He also was a big believer in the Panama Canal. Probably is one of the great achievements of Roosevelt, even if he did make a mess of things in South America, the way he went about having it done. He defended Colombia completely and supported Panama in the revolt to get the canal set, and it created all kinds of hard anti-American feelings that we see to this day, this Yankee imperialism that he had kind of created to put the Panama Canal in. But the Panama Canal, having said that, it's a remarkable achievement, and it really did wonders for trade and even our naval movements, because it instead of going thousands of miles around the southern tip of South America to get to the Pacific, you suddenly had a 50-mile canal that you could cut through from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and it saved all kinds of travel and difficult issues that way by having the Panama Canal. Roosevelt went down to visit the Panama Canal. He took his wife with him, and she was, they went there I think in 1906, and he became the first president. This is, when I first found out about this, I was pretty surprised about it, but it's the reality is that he was the first president to leave the United States as an incumbent president when he went down in 1906. So from Washington, 1789 to 1906, we never had a president leave the continental U.S. None of them ever traveled overseas or even to South America. And so Roosevelt visited the Panama Canal, and there's a famous picture of him with a hat on and covering his eyes with the sun, and he's in it like a tractor, helping push the dirt to get the Panama Canal built. So.
Should we bring them closer to home and talk Medora again?
Medora.
The library and the
yes.
cabin.
And the cabin.
Yes, yeah, Maltese cross cabin. Long story, I'll make it real short. But he left any number of reasons. Cattle was diminished. There were terrible blizzards that wiped out like 60% of Teddy Roosevelt's cattle, and then even greater numbers for a lot of ranchers and cattlemen in 1886, 87. And so Roosevelt just decided to eventually give up his investments out there. I think 1898 was the last of his investments in Medora that he gave up. But the Cross Ranch cabin he had built, or he had purchased actually in like 1883, 84 when he was out there the first time. And they decided to move the cabin. They wanted to show it at the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. And that was also the Lewis and Clark Centennial commemoration, which was a big deal. So they brought the Maltese cross cabin out to St. Louis, the World's Fair. People saw it and thought it was very interesting. And then they brought it back and put it on the grounds of the state capitol in Bismarck in 1906, and they just kept it there, and it really just deteriorated. And the Daughters of the American Revolution, the local chapter, was quite concerned about that, and they went to the state legislature. The legislature passed legislation putting them basically in control and care of the Maltese Cross Ranch, and so cross cabin, and so they rehabilitated it, they repaired it, and they opened it up to the public during the summer from 1926 until 1959, so the public could come through and see the cabin. And then in 1959, it was moved back to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, where it's located today, real close to the South Unit Visitors Center. And FDR, like I mentioned earlier, visited it when he was here in 1936 on his drought tour. And then Dwight Eisenhower, we'll talk about our next segment, he stopped and also wanted to see it when he was here in 1953 for the closure of the Garrison Dam.
So we're very proud of that the Daughters of the American Revolution, that we're about preservation and again about history. And so we are really looking forward to the opening of the Theodore Roosevelt Library in Medora. It almost feels like it comes full circle.
It does, and that's exciting. The whole TR library opening, that's coming right up. It's about, you want to talk a little bit about that now, or we want to hold off on that maybe, or?
Shall we retire to the kitchen first?
Yes.
And you can talk about the library as we cook.
That would be great.
Perfect.
We are going to be talking about one of Teddy Roosevelt's favorite recipes, favorite food. When he lived out on the prairie, it was hard work, and you needed to have a good hearty meal. And one of his favorites was fried chicken with white gravy. We're putting mashed potatoes with it. And then a favorite is a clove cake, a very, very flavorful cake. Well, let's get cooking. We're going to be making Teddy's favorite fried chicken today. I am starting with 4 chicken thighs that I have been brining overnight in 1 cup of buttermilk and 1 beaten egg. When you mix up your brine, make sure that you put it in either a glass container, porcelain container. That's what they would have used back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In our day and age, for me, it's easier to just put it in a Ziploc bag and marinate it. But I marinated it overnight so it gets the flavors, but also it tenderizes the chicken. With that, we are going to dredge it in a flour mixture, and that includes salt and pepper, garlic powder, paprika, and onion powder. We're going to mix this thoroughly and make a nice dredge for the chicken. So once that is mixed, we'll take the chicken thighs out. And if you want, you can actually take these and put them on paper towel to get a little of the excess brine off of them. Today I'm just going to put them right in the dredge. So I'm going to put them in the flour. Mix it around, make sure that they're well coated, and then I will place them on a rack to rest while I brine the rest of them. The brining really gives a good flavor to the chicken, makes it interesting, and the dredging will help make it a crispy crust on our chicken. So with that, we'll move it over. A little bit messy, but that's okay. To me, cooking is kind of all about the mess. Sometimes that happens. So we have 4 thighs that we have dredged in the flour. And what I usually do and what I usually recommend is that you let the chicken rest with the flour coating. Because the longer you let it rest, the more it adheres to the chicken, and it will give you a crusty, a crust on your chicken, and it will be crispier. So once that has rested, and we're going to pretend that it rested for a period of time, I'm going to put it in frying pan. Today I'm using iron skillets. That's what they would have used back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But I like using it nowadays because, again, it makes for great crispy chicken. So what we're going to do, it's rested. I'm going to put about 1 inch of oil in my fry pan, warm it up, and then I'll be putting my chicken thighs in and frying the chicken thighs. While I'm frying the chicken, we're going to get an etiquette lesson from one of our DAR members who is sharing etiquette from the first White House cookbook of 1887.
Ladies have frequently had an effective way of holding the knife halfway down its length, as if it were too big for their little hands. But this is awkward a way as it is weak. The knife should be grasped freely by the handle only, the forefinger being the only one to touch the blade, and that only along the back of the blade at its root, and no further down.
So Connie, while I fry up our chicken thighs, could you please demonstrate for us the recipe for Teddy's favorite clove cake?
Oh, sure. I think when we talked earlier about food being part of culture, it's true. And recipes are something that kind of, I think, ran around the country. If I look at vintage cookbooks, I can recognize some of the recipes from today. I'm going to try to minimize the noise I make with Mrs. Roosevelt's clove cake, and that's what the recipe is called, Mrs. Teddy Roosevelt's clove cake. So this would be Edith, and apparently it was quite the popular recipe, but it's also a very dense cake and quite flavorful. A little bit perhaps on the dry side, so we're going to tell you how to fix that. The cake is interesting because as recipes moved around the country, of course, there can be errors that get built in. So this version from a woman who claims that she is a California woman who's lawyer by day and vintage recipe cook by night, Leslie at bakethiscake.com said the version that she saw was incorrectly listed from a method standpoint. So it said to beat the butter and the milk together, and that of course doesn't work. If you've ever made a cake and failed at that, join the club. So we're going to be using a stick of butter and a cup of sugar, and I've beaten this together just to save on noise and time. And then the directions, and you'll hear a little noise, sorry, but the directions say then to beat in the eggs. And when it's fluffy, and you feel like they're mixed well together, then we're going to add the 2 cups of flour. It's a half teaspoon of cloves, half teaspoon of allspice, a half teaspoon of cinnamon, and a teaspoon and a half of nutmeg. If that sounds excessive to you, it did to me. I didn't cut it out. I'm making it the way it was listed, but I will tell you that the spices blend, and it's not a nutmeg forward cake. But then the directions say that you're going to alternately beat in the flour. And then milk, and then we'll add the rest of the flour. And our goal is just a nice, smooth cake batter. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, there's molasses in this cake. The leavener is soda, but the instructions are to stir the molasses and soda together and then add them last, just before you fold in the fruit. And I'll tell you about the fruit in a minute. You may have noticed the mixer began to gear down. It is quite a thick batter. We're going to stir the soda. It's a teaspoon of soda and half a cup of molasses. And molasses was a popular sweetener back in the day. Refined sugar was not quite as common as it is today. So we just stir those together briefly and then put the whole container into the cake. Now it's going to make quite a dark and dense cake. And when you bake it, you will think, oh, this is like Grandma's spice cake. That's what it reminds me of. Again, we stop when it's smooth, and then the last step is to fold in It calls for raisins that you can plump in hot water and then drain, or dates. In my case, I'm using both. And if you think your family doesn't like dates, I will tell you that you do not bite into this cake and say, "Are there dates in the cake?" They disappear. So now we're at a point where we're going to fold in. We're finished with the mixer. We're going to fold it in, and I'm going to talk briefly about pans. Beth and I were having a discussion about pans. This is her tube pan. This is the pan that Teddy probably would be used to seeing this shape. Some of you will think, oh, that looks just like my grandma's angel food cake pan. Yes, it does. You'll see the finished product is going to be baked in a bundt pan, but Teddy would not have had a bundt pan available. They did not come out until 1950. I wasn't even born yet when the pans first came out. The Nordic Ware Baking Company, a St. Louis, Minnesota baking company, the Dahlquist brothers had friends that asked for a pan in which they could bake Kugelhof. And that's a popular Eastern European yeasted cake. So I have heavily greased a bundt pan. By the way, when the pans first came out, they weren't all that popular. But about the time the brothers were deciding to get rid of the bundt pan, the Pillsbury Bake-Off contest was already rolling. And the Tunnel of Fudge Cake was one of the winners that year. I think it was 1966. And that's when bundt sales really took off. So I don't own a tube pan, but Beth has generously provided one so you can look at the difference. Now this is going to bake for 45 minutes at 350. If it's not ready, do the toothpick test. You can touch the center of the cake. If it springs back, it's ready. One of the Great British Bake-Off bakers said his grandma taught him to take the cake out and listen to it. And if you could still hear that faint snap, crackle, pop, then it wasn't ready. I have a convection oven. It was ready in 47 minutes. So this is going to go into the oven, and we're going back to chicken.
Thank you, Connie. So while I am going to dish up my chicken and get ready for gravy, Rick, tell us a little bit more about Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt was the only person to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Nobel Peace Prize. The Medal of Honor he received for his charge up San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Especially the San Juan charge was crucial in helping end that short war, made Teddy Roosevelt a war hero, and also helped build up his political credentials because he was no longer just an Easterner, dabbling in New York politics or being involved in New York politics. He was this war hero who had been in this charge up San Juan Hill, and of course his cowboy ranching heritage that he had from Medora. And then he got the Nobel Peace Prize for helping negotiate. He was the intermediary between Russia and Japan to end the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. Roosevelt had a very rambunctious set of children, 6 altogether. His wife Alice, of course, had died at the age of 22, had the daughter Alice. And then he had 5 additional children with Edith, his second wife. And during the White House years, they were the kids were known as the White House Gang, and they had all kinds of antics and animals. They had a Shetland pony. They'd like put it in White House elevator and put the pony up and down in the elevator. They would throw spitballs at the paintings on the walls of the White House, and Teddy Roosevelt would admonish them, "You can't do that. These are presidential and first lady and other painting portraits." They had a parrot that they trained to say, "Hip, hip, hooray" for Teddy Roosevelt. They had a one-legged rooster. I mean, you just name it. They had just all kinds of a menagerie. at the White House. Roosevelt also visited North Dakota only one time as president. He came out here in 1903. He'd been out here many times, of course, during his Medora years and had gone back east during the winter months. But only one time he came out here in 1903. It was a train trip, and he stopped in any number of places, Dickinson, Bismarck, Jamestown, and he got to Medora and had a wonderful reunion with a lot of his old friends out of Medora. There's a very interesting photograph. All these people are packed in around Teddy, having a picture taken of his trip to Medora. He had a great barbecue on the Capitol grounds in Bismarck. He wolfed down a couple of roast beef sandwiches and really enjoyed his time there. Then he crossed the river and there were like 4,000 or 5,000 people that met with him in Mandan. So he had a really marvelous time here as one time as president. And then he came back 4 additional times after he left the White House. Last time was just 3 months before he died. He visited Fargo, I think Dickinson and Jamestown, or Dickinson and Bismarck. Spoke at a breakfast. In October 1918, he blasted the Nonpartisan League as being being pro-Bolshevist because he thought that their politics he didn't agree with. But he was out there also trying to sell war bonds to help fund the World War I effort, which was coming to a close by that time. So, Roosevelt was everywhere. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about his travel down the Amazon when we talk about books, The River of Doubt.
You know, Rick, I read something interesting about his daughter Alice, that she was quite the social presence in Washington for something like 60 years, 6 decades. And she had some colorful sayings, but apparently she had a needlepoint pillow by her favorite, on her favorite sofa that said, "If you can't say something good about someone, sit by me."
That's right. That's right. She did, and she knew she had met every president from Benjamin Harrison through Ronald Reagan, and her nickname was the Second National Monument or Second Washington Monument, for a long time, getting an invitation to one of her parties was a premier ticket in the Washington social scene, I've heard her referred to as a female Teddy Roosevelt. And if she had his personality, she had his charisma, she had his energy. And if she had been a man, who knows where she might have gone in national politics. She was married to the Speaker of the House for quite a while. And she lived to the grand old age of 96. Had a chance to meet Jimmy Carter as president-elect. He said, "I'm not interested." So she cut it off at Ronald Reagan as the last president she met.
Well, I'm going to jump back to cooking. So we are going to make gravy because Teddy loved gravy and he poured it all over his chicken and of course potatoes. So I took the chicken thighs out of the frying pan. I reduced some of the grease, but I do have some of the oil that I used for cooking the chicken. And there's going to be little bits of coating still in the pan, which is great because those are little bits of flavor. So I am going to add flour to the oil and I'm going to mix it around. And this is making a roux. And what that is a thickener for our gravy. So we're going to mix it around. It's going to take on a beautiful color, a beautiful tan color as it mixes in with the oil. And it will be somewhat thick.
Beth, it looks like you have a treasure of a cast iron pan there.
I do, yes, yes. I feel very strongly, and some of these were handed down to me from my mother, who was a fabulous cook. Thank you. In fact, my mother was a home ec teacher at one point in time. So I learned a lot of how to cook from my mother. I was pretty fortunate. I'm adding to my roux now milk, and I'm going to stir it in. I'm going to turn it down a little bit. And this will just gradually thicken. And so once you get all of the milk incorporated, it will become a very thick gravy. At that point, you can add your salt and pepper or any other seasonings that you like included in your gravy. This, I had already added the seasonings to the flour, so it's easy to incorporate it in. Now, here's something that's a little bit different that I have never done until I picked up Teddy's gravy recipe, and that is they added a little bit of apple cider vinegar.
I have the vinegar for you.
Thank you.
It's a surprising ingredient.
It's a very surprising ingredient, and it gives the gravy just a little bit of a tang. Yes.
To go with the buttermilk.
Right, yes. So it's really an interesting combination and an interesting flavor. So our gravy is thickening, and while I finish up the gravy, I'm going to turn it over to our DAR chapter members for another tip of etiquette from the 1800s.
The cream cake and anything of similar nature would be eaten with a knife and fork, never bitten. Asparagus, which should always be served on bread so it can absorb excess moisture, may be taken from the finger to the thumb if it is to be set before you. The whole of it may be eaten. Pastries should be broken and eaten with a fork, never cut with a knife. Raw oysters should be eaten with a fork, also fish. Peas and beans, as well known, require the fork only. However, food that cannot be held with a fork should be eaten with a spoon. Potatoes, if mashed, should be mashed with a fork. Green corn should be eaten from the cob, but it must be held with a single hand.
While we've been cooking, I have made mashed potatoes, so please feel free to use your own recipe for it. These are just basic mashed potatoes. But I'm going to plate up my chicken thighs and my gravy. And while I do that, Rick, can you share with us some of the books that you would recommend on Teddy Roosevelt?
Sure. I'll begin with, we talked first about Rutherford B. Hayes. And this is, it's a thin book, but it's a very good book. And it's a series that I wanted to introduce to those of you who aren't familiar with. It's called the American Presidents series, and edited by Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., who very prominent historian for many years. He passed away a few years ago, and then it was taken over by Sean Willens, who was a historian at Princeton University. But both of these books, Benjamin Harrison and Rutherford B. Hayes, are from this American Presidents series. And what I really like about these books, they're written by scholars, very, very serious credentials as historians, and they're just a really good, quick, but comprehensive reading in their own way about all the presidents. And every president is covered in this series, from George Washington all the way up through George W. Bush. And they haven't had books come out on Obama or Biden yet, and obviously not Trump, but I know they're working on those. But it's a wonderful series called the American Presidents series. This is considered by many people to be the best, probably, single biography of Teddy Roosevelt. At least it was for many decades. It came out in 1961. Power and Responsibility, The Life and Times of Theodore Roosevelt by William H. Harbaugh, a prominent historian for many years at the University of Virginia. And it came out, a revised edition, in the mid-70s, and it's just a really good, solid read on TR in the White House, his early years in New York, his time in the Badlands, and does a particularly good job covering the coal strike of 1902 and his conservation efforts. Now, this is the third of a trilogy of books written by Edmund Morris. This is Colonel Roosevelt, his post-presidential years. His other two books, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt was the very first one. That won the Pulitzer Prize. And then his second book was Theodore Rex. And then this is the third volume of the trilogy of books that Edmund Morris wrote on on Teddy Roosevelt. Very, very good, a trilogy, lots of reading, but again, lots of good information. This is the Bible for his time in Medora and in North Dakota. It's called The Romance of My Life. It came out in 1989 during North Dakota Centennial, Theodore Roosevelt's speeches in Dakota. And it has every speech that he's delivered in North Dakota from the time he was in Medora all the way until his last visit in 1918, just a couple of months before his death. It's a wonderful read. Anyone interested in Teddy Roosevelt, this is an essential book. This one, The River of Doubt. This is really a very gripping read about after he left the White House, he went on this adventure on the Amazon River in 1913-14 with others that almost killed him. It was a very brutal journey of 2 or 3 months. They were trying to get to this river, which had previously not been mapped. And there were 19 people in the expedition. 3 ended up dying, 1 drowned, 1 was murdered, and the murderer disappeared into the jungle, never to be seen again. Roosevelt lost almost 60 pounds. It got so bad that at one point he said, "Leave me behind and you proceed forward to finish the mission." And his son Kermit was on the journey, he wouldn't do that. And they got out, but it definitely took a lot of life out of Teddy Roosevelt. Only lived 5 more years after this, but this is a phenomenal read about his travel down the Amazon. And the river they discovered, the River of Doubt, in 1914, was named after Roosevelt. They renamed it, called the Roosevelt Rio. The Roosevelt River is what it's known as today. And you can't give recommendations on a Teddy Roosevelt books without at least having one about his incredible daughter Alice. And this is a wonderful read, came out about 15 years ago by Stacy Cordry, all about Alice Roosevelt Longworth, an incredible, incredible woman, absolutely. And then there's so many books about FDR. This is a really good read by Gene Edward Smith, FDR, came out about 20 years ago. And it just does a really good job of his rise and covering his rise in New York politics, his run for the presidency, his time in the White House. Again, a very, very good book. So again, this is just a few of the many, many books that are available, obviously, about these presidents and Alice Roosevelt Longworth.
Thanks, Rick. I'm going to finish plating this. Connie, if you could please get your clove cake out of the oven, and we'll get ready for Rick to do a taste test on what we've been able to prepare. In the meantime, we're going to hear from Bob Curran from our DAR chapter, who will discuss membership information for those curious about joining the DAR organization.
Hello, my name is Barbara Curran, and I am a daughter of the American Revolution. The Daughters of the American Revolution, or DAR, was founded by 4 women in 1890. Their mission was to serve others by focusing on historic preservation, education, and patriotism. In the 136 years since, more than 1 million women have joined the DAR to honor their heritage and make a difference in their community through volunteerism and service work. Today, the DAR provides support for our military members as well as veterans, owns and maintains historic sites and properties across the country, and supports the education of students through schools and scholarships. In addition to this, we have over 75 other committees, such as Flag of the United States of America, Genealogical Records, Records Preservation, Community Service Awards, and Conservation. With the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence this summer, the DAR is leading the way with the America 250th Committee. We are the first Heritage Society to formally partner with the nationwide America 250 Commission. The DAR is working to honor Revolutionary War patriots, engage youth through contests and educational programming, and to support efforts to better tell the story of underrepresented and diverse patriots who helped to win the American War of Independence. If this sounds like an organization you'd like to be a part of, please go to www.dar.org and fill out a member interest form. Membership is open to women aged 18 and older who can prove they are a direct descendant of someone who either fought in or supported the American Revolutionary War. If this sounds daunting, it isn't. There are people like me standing ready to help you discover your roots and honor your heritage.
Connie, the cake turned out really well. It's beautiful, and it looks like you've got the caramel sauce on top of it.
The caramel sauce was a recommendation because this cake is quite dense and can feel a little dry. So I put a little caramel sauce on top, and I'm going to drizzle some more because life is better with caramel.
That's right.
And it is simply, it gets a little thick as it sets. So that's why I'm spooning it. But it's just a 1/4 cup butter, and then it's a cup of brown sugar, a cup of cream, a teaspoon of vanilla. I just simmered it for 5 minutes, and it's still loose enough, but a little glumpy.
Yeah.
Sure.
But Rick.
Okay.
Well, and it looks fabulous, and of course, if individuals don't like caramel sauce, it's always great with whipped cream or ice cream, my husband's favorite. So, okay, Rick.
If I get a chance
It's
to
the
dig
moment
in here.
of
All right.
moment of truth here.
All right. We'll see
Tell
if
us what you think.
I'll see what Teddy Roosevelt would have thought
Yes.
of this. Give him a taste here.
The taste test.
Given his hearty appetite, he probably would have eaten it no matter what.
I
That's
think so.
true.
That's
Yes,
right.
that's true. That's right. Oh,
Crispy good.
okay.
But you know that gravy's got a little punch to it.
It does. It does. I have to say, personally, in making the gravy, I would leave the vinegar out. But again, it's an acquired taste, and those were different times. So, yeah.
My grandma put vinegar in gravy, and she
Did she?
loved it, but she liked vinegar.
Okay.
You could definitely taste the vinegar
Yeah, yeah,
in this.
yeah.
Otherwise, good. Well, don't forget to leave room for his favorite dessert.
Absolutely delicious. Now I'll try some of this dessert.
Yeah.
Smothered in caramel.
Beautiful cake.
Oh yeah. That's very good. That's very good. It's got a nice, very moist,
Spice.
very moist, and delicious topping. And I can see why Teddy Roosevelt loved this too.
So you said, did you tell me he had a sweet tooth?
Oh yes, he did. It was notorious, and one of the things that he loved to do, he put as much as 7 lumps of sugar
Wow.
in a cup of coffee
Wow.
because he just loved his sweet taste,
Yeah.
and so he would he would do that. And
So imagine
Great.
having sweetened coffee
Yeah,
with this.
yeah. A little coffee with the sugar. Yeah.
that's the way to put it. A little coffee with his 7 lumps of sugar.
Yeah, yeah.
But this is delicious. Isn't it?
Well,
nice.
while Rick enjoys our clove cake, thank you for joining us for the President's Kitchen Cabinet and History on a Fork. We encourage you to make this 250th birthday party your own. Visit Medora and the newest presidential library, view exhibits at the North Dakota Heritage Center and local museums to learn more about our state. Line the parade route for Mandan's annual 4th of July parade, or cozy up with a biography of your favorite president. Take your family camping and experiment with cooking over an open fire like our ancestors did.
Have fun celebrating America's special birthday this year. A semi-quincentennial comes along only once in a lifetime. Thanks for joining us.